Hello, welcome to everybody who's back from the coffee break. We still have 5 minutes to go, but I just wanted to say hello to the panelists as I did not meet them. Zsolt Molnár, and I've seen you. Hello, welcome. I think the technical team will have to give you the permission to open your microphone. And let's see.
And it works.
Ah, there you
Can you
are.
hear me?
Welcome. Thank you so much for
Perfect.
entering, for coming here to my stage. Let's see whether Harini Nagendra is also already in this room. For some minutes ago, we were still looking for her, and then I read in the chat that she has entered. Oh, there you are. Welcome, Harini Nagendra.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to our speech. I don't know whether when you just entered, we just had a discussion on telecoupling, on negative impacts of, let's say, European corporations extracting raw materials and resources in the global south. And we had this very interesting discussion whether private or political rules can help to hinder the loss of biodiversity, or whether we need a new system of economy, a degrowth system with convivialism as the most powerful leading rule. And we just started a discussion when the coffee break started, and now it's up to our panel and up to our session to find solutions to this question. And well, I guess you feel you have something to say on that too.
Yeah, we can touch upon some of the slices of this really complex and
Actually, yeah.
challenging, challenging both scientifically and socially. Yeah.
That's what we learned. One of the panelists said, okay, we don't know enough about these systems of governing the loss of biodiversity. We need some more years, and maybe the time is over then because the loss is irreversible. So let's see what we find out. And of course, it needs more time then. Welcome back to everyone. I hope you had a nice short break, and you also took the chance to get into contact with the other participants of the conference and the virtual poster session. In this plenary forum, in the last session today, we want to learn how to moderate conflicts and biodiversity protection, which is actually what we talked about the whole day, because whenever we talk about biodiversity conservation and the reversal of the loss of biodiversity, we find there are a lot of conflicts coming up because the interests of humans are not congruent with the interests of nature, of biodiversity. So now we want to discuss the role of traditional and local knowledge, and we also take a special look at the nature in Indian cities and megacities and how to moderate the conflicts there. And I'm really curious what we will learn in this session, because we journalists and also farmers and conservationists in Germany keep asking these questions too. About, for example, about the reappearance of the wolf that creates a lot of problems with the farmers who keep cattle on their grasslands. And we also have this question, where has our traditional and maybe indigenous knowledge gone, with a lot of people like me having grown up in a farm and having seen that the knowledge that their great grandparents and grandparents once had is gone, because there was one generation in between that had different practices, and now there are no written resources to find out what traditional knowledge might be. So you see, I have a lot of questions to you, but first we start by hearing your experience. And I would like to start with Zsolt Molnár. He is the head of the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Research Group at the Center for Ecological Research in Hungary. He is a botanist, but also an ethnoecologist with a lot of international experience. He was a member of the IPBES, Indigenous and Local Knowledge Task Force, until last year. And you were also a coordinating lead author in the IPBES Global Assessment that came up in 2019. And so you will not only talk about Hungary and the problems with herders there, but also about Romania, Serbia, Mongolia, Mongolia, Iran, and Kenya, and always having in mind this idea. So what is traditional knowledge, and how does it react to scientific knowledge and, well, an extractive economy? I'm really interested to listen to your talk, Zsolt Molnár.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah. So I will not speak about, of course, all of my field experience in different countries, but during the discussions after the presentations, we can discuss other topics as well. In these 15 minutes, I would like to focus on knowledge and the role of knowledge in conflicts. So we know that land users and conservationists or nature has very different interests. That's okay. But are these conflicting interests real or only presumed? And I would like to raise the issue of the hidden cause of many of these conflicts, which is knowledge asymmetry. So the locals and the conservationists have a different knowledge, and the role of misunderstanding between different stakeholders. And I will touch upon the issue of power, how we use power in conservation. A very brief definition of what is indigenous traditional knowledge. It's a cumulative body, and not only knowledge, but practices and worldviews. It's multi-generational. It's not static, but adapted by each generation, not only about nature, but also the relationship with nature and between people. And when we are speaking about traditional knowledge, we usually distinguish 4 levels of this knowledge, from the knowledge of species and habitats, through the knowledge of management and its impact, and also the ecological dimensions of social institutions, rules and norms, and of course the worldview, mentality and values, what these local people have. And if we want to overcome the problem of conflicts, avoid and resolve conflicts, we have to cover all 4 levels. And for social scientists, the right side is more easy, and for ecologists, the left side. But we shouldn't forget that we need to think about all 4 levels. How do we do research? Because I'm an academic researcher. So when I'm doing research, then I can have different approaches. We have research that is classically ecological, conservation biological, but there are studies when we are studying people, studying people's knowledge. But there's also research when we are doing the research together in close collaboration with traditional ecological knowledge holders. And increasingly in the last years, actually, an influence by IBES, that we are doing research for those people who have this traditional and local ecological knowledge. When we are in Europe, we very rarely speak about decolonization. Decolonization is somewhere in the former colonies, but how nature conservation functions in Europe is very colonial. And I will give you some examples of that. So when we are speaking about decolonizing research and conservation, we shouldn't forget about our European situation. When we are speaking about people, traditional local land users, they are very diverse. And I only show 3 categories. One is these old guys who have 4 or 6 elementary schools, and they argue that they learned from life, not from books. There are traditional knowledge holders who like reading ethnography. So they are traditional knowledge holders, but also reading science. And there are many modern land users who do have a lot of traditional knowledge, but they are using modern techniques and modern behavior when they are managing land. This guy is actually monitoring the beaver impact with iPhone. And these people have not only diverse behavior, but diverse knowledges, changing knowledge. There's lots of hybrid knowledge in Europe. When a knowledge holder has really centuries old traditional knowledge, on the other side, learned something from the internet yesterday. just some example what they know, because one of the reasons conservationists and ecologists rarely speak with local knowledge holders that they don't believe that they are knowledgeable. And this is just 3 species of grass that look very similar, but if you ask a herder in Eastern Hungary, they can, for many, many minutes, they can speak about these species, the ecological needs of the species, the population dynamics of the species, and how their livestock prefers or avoids these species. If you don't know the local names, you will not be able to speak with these guys. This is the fly knowledge of one single village in Western Romania. I think 20 species. So if you speak with these people, you can ask about many insects. They know more than 200 invertebrate species, but if you don't know the local names, it's not easy to speak with them. And this is a folk habitat classification, a landscape partitioning in the Eastern Carpathians in Romania by Chango people. We did similar studies in Mongolia and Serbia and Hungary, and we can argue that locals can name all pieces of land by specific folk habitat names. So if you want to plan a management in a protected area, these people will use local names, and you have to understand these local names to speak with them deeply on ecology and conservation. And I mention these because speaking with locals can overcome the problem of knowledge asymmetry and misunderstanding. If you spend hours, days with these people in the field, then you will better understand them, and that can avoid conflict or resolve conflicts. We made a study which was co-produced by conservationist herders and researchers on how they want to manage 2 habitat types. The upper one is the salt steppe, and the lower is the wood pasture. And what we found that the objectives are very often common, but between herders and conservation rangers, but how to achieve these objectives, what practices, what land use practices, what management practices to be used or held adequate are more conflicting. So you can agree about the objectives more easily than about how to achieve those conflicts, those objectives. And this is what this guy said in a film we prepared for IBES in 1916 for the European assessment, European Central Asia assessment. He argued that many of these conflicting interests are actually just presumed. He said, conservation rangers wouldn't talk to us 20 years ago. They criticize us without asking us anything. Now they stop, we agree on about 90% of things. This film is available on YouTube, so you can see what the 3 herders said to the authors of the IBES Europe and Central Asia assessment, because this film was, so the questions they answer in the film are actually the key questions of the IBES assessment. It's available in English with English subtitles. Another interesting new study by our research group is when we speak about corncrake, which is an umbrella and flagship species of conservationists in Europe, all conservationists I met are sure that locals know this species because this species has very characteristic sound. The Latin name short, cracks, 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 cracks. And all night the birds are calling. And the conservationists just simply cannot believe that locals do not recognize this sound and do not connect to the species. However, the agri-environmental scheme for this bird is one of the most common scheme they apply for and they get paid for. So European and Romanian nature conservation pays for these farmers to protect a bird they don't even know. Some people know this species, but they do not only understand cracks or corncrake, but 2 other species. So it's really not sure what they think about the needs of the species. They know the second and third species much better than the first one. So we can spend a lot of money, but if we misunderstand what the locals know about nature, can be a source of failure. And this is another new study by Esther Fodor, on how invasive alien species in central Hungary are valued by locals. And we distinguished, of course, instrumental, relational, and intrinsic values. And what you would expect, that instrumental values are usually positive or negative, depending on the economic use of the species. But we expected that relational values should be negative, because if the species is invasive, alien to the area and spreading, then they need to have some negative relational value. This is not true. There are much more positive relational value examples than negative ones. And quite unexpectedly, we even found some intrinsic value related to some of these species. So totally disconnected with instrumental value and relational value. You can see the colors that these species can also have red, so negative instrumental or relational value. So how to move forward, because this is one of the questions of this conference. My suggestion is just speak with the locals. And this is an example when Fikret Berkös visited Hungary, and he went to this guy, with a traditional herder, János Máté, and because Fikret was able to watch the film we made with János about his grazing, Fikret could have a 5 hours long discussion with this guy, of course with translations, and they both enjoyed the very rich, information-rich and experience-rich discussion. You can see the dogs are also very much looking and listening. And these partnerships, knowledge partnerships, what we built with herders in Hungary and Serbia and Romania, these are not simply fair if we can apply decolonized methods, but also very rich. And Fikret Berkös just published a book on community-based conservation, where the basis is that conservationist scientists are working together with local communities, and very often these conservation actions are community-led, not simply community-based, and scientists and conservationists are invited to help locals. It's a big challenge. It's not easy to protect nature together with the community, but this is one of the most suitable ways forward. And this is a case study by Anna Varga, who interviewed herders and conservationists, 2 types of conservationists, officers working in the headquarters, rarely going to the field, and field rangers who spend most of their time in the field. And what you can see in these graphs, that conservation rangers having deep field experience have a knowledge between the headquarter ecologists, conservationists, and the herders, so they can bridge the gap between scientific conservation and resource management, resource conservation by the locals. It is really challenging to bring together scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge, and to have discussions where both groups are present and they can have discussions. So we are experimenting with different techniques. Up left corner, you see a slow film, which is a 3 hours long film about one single afternoon of a herder. Nothing happens in the film, just sheep is grazing, but the herder is answering our questions, I think 150 questions, what he sees in the film, what he is standing, why he is moving, why the sheep is standing, why the sheep is moving. And the Hungarian version of this film was watched by more than 100,000 people. Fully unexpected that modern people can sit and watch grazing sheep, of course narrated with a herder, for 3 hours. And one of the key
Zsolt, I'm
yes,
so sorry to interrupt. I have to ask you to come to an end, even though
yes,
I feel like watching
good.
sheep too and listening to you.
Okay,
Thank you.
good, good. This is my last slide.
Right.
My last slide is about decolonization and knowledge partnerships. We just published a paper 2 years ago on the social justice or social injustice inflicted on traditional knowledge holders in Europe. And there's a long list of injustices. I just listed some. And if you are an ecologist or conservation biologist, we published papers, methodological papers, how we can work together with traditional knowledge holders and how we can build knowledge partnerships. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zsolt. I have like 100,000 questions arising from this new idea of, well, binding knowledges, different knowledges together and learning from each other with the common goal to preserve biodiversity. But before we talk, we will have a short travel to India, and we will learn about the challenges in a country with a growing population that is cities getting larger and larger, and so threatening biodiversity simply by the population growth. But we see there are a lot of opportunities also. And here is a famous author and speaker, Harini Nagendra. She will present us her ideas as the director of the School of Climate Change and Sustainability in Bangalore in India. And she is interested in the conservation of forests, but also in urban sustainability. She is using a lot of technical data, remote sensing to see what's going on the ground. But she's also famous for her interest in the link between people and nature. And then there she is, very, very well connected in the scientific community as a lead author of IPCC reports and other steering committees, but also as an award-winning writer and speaker and author who can translate all this scientific knowledge to a lot of people. So I'm really, really, really excited to welcome you to the FEdA conference of today. Harini Nagendra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya. A big thank you to Christine, who is the one who invited me, and Zsolt for this fantastic, I think, other presentation. So I'll jump right into it because we have 15 minutes, and I'm going to take you into global South cities and really challenges and opportunities for implementing nature-based solutions or conservation in urban environments. So if you look at it, this is a nightlight satellite image of the world, and I just want to show you how the areas that are lit are not really only the US and Europe, which is what we would have expected to be urban, a few years ago. It's really India, China, Nigeria, places like this that are urbanizing. Here's another, for instance, a chart or a map from the UNEP, which tells you that all the reds and the yellows, the fastest growing cities of the future, are coming from the global south. So, for instance, India has 3 of the world's 10 largest cities, but it also has 3 of the world's fastest growing cities. And so much of the urban growth of the future, not only do the current largest cities come from the global south, but much of the global growth of the future, urban growth, would come from the global south. And so we really need to understand what's going on in global south cities. And I'm going to take you through one city called Bangalore, which is in South India, and it's one of India's 5th largest cities and 3rd fastest growing city. And from there, take us back to the global. So growth of Bangalore, it was a town founded in 1537, but it's an unusual town because it is based in the rain shadow of the Western Ghats. It has about 2,500 years of human habitation, though not urban. The urban history is relatively recent of 500 years ago. But the ecological history is very rich because it was, like I said, a city in the rain shadow of the Western Ghats, no perennial water systems, no coastline. So people relied on agricultural tanks or lakes. And the city was actually divided into these 2 landscapes. If you go back to the city, the west side was the hilly or the rocky terrain, and the east side is the flatter terrain. And if you look at inscription stones, so what happens in global south cities is uncovering history becomes very difficult because there is no written record. And so often, sometimes inscription stones or copper plates gives us records from, let's say, the 5th or the 6th century CE. And you get a sense of all the inscription stones that were found in the West describe this hilly, rocky landscape with wild boars, tiger attacks, hunting stone, the hero stones, boar hunts, hunting dogs, cattle raids, and the areas of high biodiversity even today. The eastern side is a very different, ecologically different landscape, even though part of the same city. And it's something we have forgotten now, but these ancient settlers knew. And they talk about wells and trees and rice and, very different kind of a pastoral system, and not a pastoral, but an agricultural system. Very different from the pastoral system with the wild animals and the free range grazing of the western side, right? And what they did in the East is created these freshwater bodies or irrigation tanks for the support of animals, cattle, birds, for people to get merit in the afterlife, for dharma to be to someone's father. These are the inscription stones that you have. You have interesting motivations which give you a glimpse of how people related to these landscapes, that they would create this lake to endure as long as the sun and the moon, or the rocks in the Kaveri river, or the grass in the earth endured. Also, my favorite, which is the curses, again gives you a sense of how people related to the landscape. Incur the sins of having slaughtered cows and Brahmins, shall be born worms and ordure. And my truly favorite curse shall be anyone who violates the terms of how this lake was created, along with the rice and the dry millet landscape, will be born the husband of his own mother, which is a truly frightful curse, right? So they were thinking very differently, very imaginatively about these landscapes. They also had this beautiful, beautiful three-dimensional appreciation of nature, which came from place to place. So a lot of these are land grants, these old inscription stones, and they describe the four boundaries of the village. When they describe it three-dimensionally, as including the wells underground and the trees above the ground, which is something no modern. I mean, we now have, Zsolt was talking about colonial. We now have the colonial influence across India in terms of land grants. And no current colonial land grant in whichever, former colony will talk about the trees above ground and the wells below ground as being part of this, so nature, biodiversity, ecosystem services, they were all part of the landscape. Today, what you have in a city is the first thing you do is you cut down the trees to build, and the second thing you do is you fill in the wells to build, right? But this was the landscape of Bangalore, even up to, so this town was constructed in 1537, and what you have is one of the oldest written descriptions, apart from the inscription stones of the city itself, is a poem of a court poet of a king, Shahji, in the 1640s, which describes a beautiful city of nature. It is today even called the Garden City, and you get a sense of how it was a garden city, animated by peafowl. The city is teamed with deep lakes. Each house had a well. There were fountains, trees thick with flowers and shade. The city was girdled by a bottomless moat glimmering with water and dotted with countless lakes, each as big as a sea, picturesque parks with creepers. A city of nature. And yet it was a semi-arid city that was a constructed city of nature. This is the semi-arid city in the Western Ghats, rain shadow, and you can see here why you need the lakes. Really, to grow anything in this landscape, you need to hold the water. And to hold the water, you need the lakes. So everything was hard won from this landscape. The lakes, the water, the trees, the rice, the agriculture, everything was hard wrestled. And yet, so from the 1880s to 1935 to 1973 to 2014, what you see is a landscape where until then, the city grew and people created more and more lakes and planted more and more trees and created more and more wells to harvest the rainwater. But what we've really documented in a paper of ours is from 1885 to 2014, the steady loss is something that happened in 1885 that flipped the system. Until then, more and more people came in, they planted more trees, they grew more agriculture, and they created more lakes and they created more wells. There was more rainwater harvesting, more tree plantation, living with nature and understanding that people needed nature. And in 1885, what happened was technology. The city it had too many people, so they decided to import water from the outside, pipe water from distant water supplies from a set of lakes outside. And they could have supplemented the city's water supply, but they chose to replace it instead with pipe water. And almost immediately you found that the lakes were filled in, the wells were, corpses were thrown in, they were talked about as cesspools of malaria. Human attitudes to nature completely changed because now you could get nature from the outside, and which is a very important point of the rupture. What urbanization does is it ruptures us from nature because we forget that we are dependent on local nature, but we pipe in water, We pipe in, we get in food, we export our waste, we import our energy, everything comes in through the pipe. And so we forget that we are dependent on water locally, on anything locally. And this gives you a sense of, this is the city of Bangalore with the municipal boundaries and the network of lakes that were there. And this is a map from the 1970s. And you'll see even by the 1970s, the center of the city has no lake. And that's because during the colonial system, they were all filled in. Because that's when the pipe water started coming in. So lakes, channels, wells are now uncared for and trees are cut. But what happens is today you have climate change and urbanization and the city is running out of water. It runs out of water in the summer and it floods in the winter, in the monsoon, just because we don't realize the importance of these lakes for our biodiversity, but also for our daily survival in the city. And Bangalore, I mean, please remember every time that I'm speaking of Bangalore, it's the story of one city, but it's not the story of just one city. It's really the story of all global South cities. I'd argue many global North cities too. Is this inevitable? This is really what I want to talk about. Are there pathways of hope where people can live together with nature, even in cities? And Zsolt talked about some beautiful examples from rural landscapes, but I'm really interested in the urban. Where are the tales of hope? So one of the tales is the new environmentalism. As people run out of water and as they see climate change, as they see pollution and heat waves, you'll see a lot of people, young to old, coming out in waves of what I call new environmentalism. And they have hashtags, social media campaigns, protests to save trees, to save lakes. And they've been very successful in many cases in pushing the government towards restoration. And this is an example of a lake restoration in a beautiful lake near where I live, where I was part of. And there are over 100 bird species that have come back to this environment after restoration. And yet, these are lakes which are focused on landscaping, exotic species, jogging and water and walking paths. There are no grazers, there are no fishers, there's no foraging, there is no traditional launderers, there's no way of interacting with the lake anymore. There's also the simplification of, so as the social ecological relationships get simplified, as in you throw out all the traditional people who depended on these lakes, no fishing, no grazing, no foraging, you also land up in simplifying the biodiversity. Because a lot of this biodiversity depended and grew for years or decades and centuries, in fact, on human-nature relationships. This is an example of a sign from the government which says no flower plucking, no damage to trees. And yet we found in a recent paper that we just surveyed 200 women from low-income families, and Ranjini Murli, I think, is also at the conference presenting, my colleague who's now in Berlin. And we found that these women, 202 women, knew about 76 different plant species. They foraged in the heart of the city. They bought forest species from other women. And we found, a lot of foraging still alive and active in the city. My first lesson of hope is that you must restore ecosystems, but not only through the new environmentalism, which can be gentrified and throw people out, and look at ecosystems as private goods or public goods. But you have to look at them as commons, where people actually interact with them in very, very visceral ways through provisioning ecosystem services. The second is the area of the mental. And what we find is, cities are places, especially in the global south, of huge numbers of migrants coming in. I mean, I think European cities also. And as more and more people come in, what happens is we found that migrants create a sense of place through environmental placemaking. I mean, as in they see in the environment a lake or a bird or a tree, and that setting reminds them of their place back home. And then, they start forging diverse, strong relationships. For instance, the migrant workers above, who find the similarity between the lake and good nature and want their child to grow up there. Or the woman below, who is from the lake, one of the original residents of the lake, but the place around her has changed. Mothers of differently abled children, transgender people who say they can sit in front of the lake because it doesn't judge them, corporate employees. So all of these places of nature are really important for placemaking. And that's a second kind of hope. And the third is that we did a paper looking at using eBird data to understand what happens with a restored lake with biodiversity. Does it really come back? I mean, plants, I was saying simplified, but what happens to birds? And what we found was, not surprisingly, resident bird species actually improve because of restoration. Migratory bird species continue to decline. And again, that's not surprising because there's a lot going on before they even reach the city. There's landscape transformation at a profoundly very large scale. And just having lakes in the city, just having ecological restoration will not help. However, there are certain kinds of things, for instance, feral dogs and cats, which lead to ground nesting birds getting impacted. For instance, the purple heron. or you have certain kinds of the species like the duck and the jacana, which tend to roost in the mud banks of lakes. What happens is when you have urbanization, you want to modernize everything, and they have stone or cement pitched bunds of the lake. And that means it's not an ecological habitat. It's again the simplification of biodiversity that happens with this kind of restoration, because nobody has bothered to talk to local communities who used to manage the lake. And this is not just lakes. You find gardens used to have fruits and ornamental trees. They become very landscaped over time. The home gardens used to have all kinds of grown species, which are food and foraging species, but they moved to apartments with manicured lawns and exotic palms that want to look like California, which actually has its exotic palms because it wants to look like the tropics. So here we are in the tropics imitating California, which wants to imitate the tropics, you know. Very strange social cultural relationships that lead to the loss of biodiversity. But there are still signs of hope, and informal settlements are one of the important refuges for multifunctional nature. These people, we think of them as low income. And in fact, one of my first papers on slums was rejected multiple times because reviewers said people in slums cannot care about biodiversity. They're going to be too worried about poverty. And yet we find they have the highest proportion of local species, of native species, of useful species. So that's another lesson. We need multi-dimensional appreciation of value, and we must focus on provisioning services, mental and physical health, spiritual and sacred needs, right? I want to end with just take you a little bit beyond this and say that this is not just in Bangalore. A recent paper of ours looking at nature-based solutions in cities of the global south we looked at 1,700 cases, first of all, and we found there were only 120 in these global databases from the global south to begin with. But where they focused on biodiversity conservation. It's the same that Zsolt was talking about, whether it's cities or not cities, whether it's a global south or not, or recreation, other aspects of nature-based solutions which are very important in global south cities, water, climate resilience, spiritual and sacred services, completely ignored. Citizen participation, completely ignored. So what's the way forward? You know, there's a beautiful image was created by our intern Rohit Rao, talking about how people can have pluralistic ways of living in the city, where the space for the street vendor, the artist, the parent, the forager, the street vendor, you know, all of these people. So I like to work ecology and history and stories into fiction and into non-fiction books. And one of the things we found was sometimes policy briefs are not what you need. You know, we did there are local wooded groves in Bangalore, and we created this bilingual story in English and Kannada or English and Hindi, and used to ask our students to illustrate this little story. And we found that not just was the government very interested, we created it online, but they wanted 6,200 print copies for the government libraries across the state. But they also created a government circular which said that these topes or these wooded groves have to be rejuvenated across all of the villages. And there was a government employment guarantee scheme which can be used for this. And we didn't expect any of this. We created a story for a village, but we found that this is our story, because it was picture-based, had far more impact than I think a dry policy brief, which I don't think would have stimulated this kind of an impact from a policymaker. Similarly, when we did the foraging study, again, Ranjini was part of the study. We converted this into a book called Chasing Soppu. And again, we got Rohit to illustrate it, but we got recipes from these women. Soppu is greens, and this is basically chasing greens in the city. And we talked about these recipes in these women and shared their stories and talked about how to identify these. And this has been this again captures people's imagination in a way that lets them understand that the city is a place of biodiversity where you can forage. This is a children's book we did, which is beautiful illustrations, which helps children again understand that leaves are small, leaves are large, you can forage in them, you can eat on them, you can cook with them, you can play with games with them, you know, and it helps. I think so. Education really is very important to bring this connection back to urban societies that are becoming decoupled from nature. And finally, this is something we've been doing for the past 3 years. At my university, we run, from the School of Climate Change, we run climate and nature festivals, because we've been trying to figure out how to educate students, especially young students, and it cannot be done in dystopic ways. I think one of the things we all recognize as educators is you have to find positive ways to connect with the young on conservation. And so we use interactive games and models and festivals which celebrate rivers, forests, mountains, and coasts. And we've dealt with 40,000 students over the past 3 years in multiple languages. So this is just my last slide. I think pathways of hope do exist. There are environmental movements by urban residents. Urban restoration can restore species, and it drives environmental placemaking, which drives action. What we need to be careful is how do we do this in a non-exclusionary way, and a way that leads to gentrification without leading to gentrification or simplification of biodiversity and human nature relationships. And for that, we need education. So with that, I'll stop and leave it open.
Thank you so much, Harini. That was really great of learning this old story of this garden city and thinking about how our cities might have looked 500, 600 years ago, and I don't even know. So thank you so much for these ideas. Can I ask Zsolt also to join our small panel here for the last 15 minutes, 20 minutes that we can talk. So far, I don't see any questions in the Q&A session, so please go ahead, feel free to ask your questions. But I use my chance and maybe ask the both of you, with Harini just having disappeared, there she is again, of whether you do agree with your very different experiences, but with a very similar approach in with people taking people with local knowledge serious and reactivating old knowledge. So, do you agree, or how do you react to each other's researchers? Who feels like
I
starting?
would, I mean, I resonated so much with what Zsolt said. And again, I do a lot of work with forests and rural areas, and everything I think to me completely resonated.
Mm.
And I think it makes complete sense. This is really how we need to move forward.
What about you, Jean?
After 30 years of research with my daughter, we decided to write a children's book on herding, because herders are very often misinterpreted. And what I saw from Harini's presentation, that children's book with pictures are very, very efficient or helpful. Also directly to the children, and also educating the teachers to do something else more than the book itself. Yeah. Congratulations to your work, Harini.
Okay,
Thank you. Likewise.
there's lots of work ahead of you, Joel. Now you have to, you or maybe your daughter, you have to write all these books too. Um, so you agree, both of you agree on the importance of people, of listening to them, of reteaching them the old knowledge, and also the co-creation maybe of what you call new ecological knowledge, I think. So it's very close and regardless whether you're talking about Hungarian pastures or mega cities in the global south. That's really a surprising finding, that the situation doesn't matter so much.
Very often it's not reteaching. If you just simply acknowledge that the knowledge from their childhood, from their mother or grandfather is valuable and not backward, not outdated, that's very often enough. You don't need to teach them very often. Just remind them that your knowledge is valuable.
That's right. But I think in the urban context, maybe that part adds on. For instance, we did some of you need to transfer it somehow. These old links are losing connection. So I'll give you two examples. One in the foraging, they say most of the women we spoke to were 40s, 50s, sometimes grandparents, and they all said that they like to eat forest greens and their husbands like to eat them, but the children don't because they're bitter and somehow they're old fashioned. So if you send it in a lunchbox to school or something, that the children feel ashamed and they want the modern greens. And similarly, we did a series of collections of songs of the lake in the region, because women have songs. And the older women knew the songs, but they said the younger ones don't know the songs anymore because it's an urban setting. You don't go to graze anymore. And because it's got swallowed by the city. And so when you lose the grazing, you also lose the songs. So I think that is something we really need to fix in the city.
Yeah.
And that's so important, but because I think in some regions in Germany, we already have lost these elder people who knew the stories, and having these shifting baselines with the biodiversity laws that has been, well, that has been active for so many years. I'm really surprised to learn about all the flowers that my grandmother knew by name, like you, Joel mentioned the Romanian herders who know so many insects, and they are gone, and we don't see them anymore. So you're doing a very, very important work to keeping and reevaluating the old knowledge. But now here are two questions, and let me just check the first one that I picked, which was by the FEdA team. It goes to Harini. How do you tackle the risk of spreading disease due to mosquitoes by reintroducing water and lakes into the cities of India?
Okay, that's an interesting one. Normally what the government would do is to spray, and this is so if there's a good spraying program of, for instance, putting oil on the lakes or putting certain kinds of fish in the lakes, you can reduce the risk of, dengue or malaria or whatever, mosquito-borne diseases. But what I would say is there are other risks also, because if you don't have them, what you really have is a very large risk of flooding and drought and heat waves, and those are risks that really impact the whole city. Whereas mosquito-borne diseases are a problem, but I think there are ways in which they can be dealt with. Whereas on the other hand, if you don't have the lakes, you have other kinds of climate-related problems which can be much worse.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for reminding us. And yeah, heat waves, I guess they are really more extreme than what we experience. And even in the cold climate of Germany, we have people dying from heat. So we can imagine how hard this is for you.
Right.
I take another question that goes, thank you for the nice presentations to both of you. My question is, how do you see the ontological and epistemological difficulties of bringing together, synthesizing knowledge from very different knowledge domains? Is it always possible to bring them together, or are there situations where there is incommensurability between the different knowledge traditions? So I remember Zsolt who said it's not easy to get people talk together. So who
Yeah.
wants to answer? You start.
Yeah, so it's a glass half water with half water. So in Europe, the situation is very different than in many other colonial settings. In Europe, science developed from traditional knowledge. In Europe, science and traditional knowledge communicated for millennia, for centuries. So the difference between science and traditional knowledge is much less than like in North America, or especially in Australia or New Zealand. So in Europe, we are in a much better situation. The other is that you don't need to integrate mixed knowledge. There are very nice methods like the multiple evidence base or two-eye seeing and other knowledge co-production techniques where you don't mix the two knowledges, but you just put the two knowledges on the same table and discuss what to do with these knowledges. And then there is almost no problem of epistemology. If you don't overemphasize it, then it's manageable. Of course, there can be problems. For example, in Canada, killing wolves is more ethical than sterilizing wolves, according to First Nation people. Because if you kill a wolf, then it's a correct way. You just simply kill it. But if you sterilize, then you disrespect wolf. And killing wolf is less unrespectful than sterilizing them. So that's an issue of worldview. But I think with discussion, you can solve these issues more or less.
What about you, Harini? I'm very interested
Yeah,
in your
we've not tried to put them on the same page in the same way, but I agree. What I would do by instinct is to create these different ways of seeing. For instance, one, thing that is very apparent when you talk to communities. So in global south cities like Bangalore, what happens is the village stays in the same place, but the city swallows it. And it's not like the village is urbanized, but it's really still a village and the city is around it. And so you have people with very rural ways of life who have originally been the stewards of these ecosystems. And if you ask them, they have very interesting kinship relationships with nature. So for instance, there is a series of 7 sister goddesses and 1 brother, and they're different villages, but they're also, one goddess likes trees, one likes lakes, one likes people, one doesn't like people. And then the temples get together at different times for festivals, and then they govern certain resources together. So it's spatial and spiritual and sacred. And so you can talk about some of these relationships. But what I think my comment would be the one time that I saw people can switch. We were talking to municipalities and doing a training program for them, members of the municipality, dealing with governance. And when you talk to them about things like this, they would immediately say, yes, my grandfather used to forage, or I used to go, or I still go to these temple festivals, and I know about this goddess, and I know. And then you would say, here is how you should actually be restoring the lake without the stone pitching, for instance. Or here is how you should be then protecting these trees. And then suddenly the administrative hat changes and they say, no, 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 but in the city we can't do it because of all of these engineering-based or contract-based considerations. And so they're flipping in their minds between different ontologies and epistemologies, right? Because they are at home, they're one human being. At the workplace, they're another Western trained human being, right? And so that I found that flip in the mind that came suddenly in 5 minutes very interesting. And then I was thinking, how does one actually break this and get them to be the same person in both contexts, or appreciate both points of view in both contexts?
That's so interesting. That's a question that I ask myself again, seeing where the traditional agriculture, a lot of us in Europe come from, and then where the contact between the traditional knowledge of nature and the modern view on, let's say, agriculture, for example, has driven apart. So I would like to continue, but there is another very interesting and very urgent question that is, it goes to Zsolt, but I think it's also concerning the situation in India, how to best preserve traditional knowledge and how much is the traditional knowledge impacted by climate change, which is, of course, a new question that indigenous people never so far had to deal with. This is change that is so dramatic.
Yeah. You can only preserve traditional knowledge if you preserve traditional management systems. There's another way which is much less efficient if you, for example, bring in traditional knowledge into organic farming or regenerative farming or sustainable forestry. It is less efficient, but bits of traditional knowledge can be saved there. I would say that if we stop the development, stop the change of traditional knowledge, we are not saving it. And this is the second part of the question. So I don't think climate change is a huge problem to traditional knowledge, because climate has always been changing. Many other things in nature and society have been changing. So traditional knowledge is ready for adapting to the changes. The problem is the external drivers and the governance system. So for a traditional knowledge system to be dynamic and adaptive, you need an adequate governance system. And many of the governments and conservations, but national parks do not allow the development of traditional knowledge. And that's the problem. Climate change is an issue and an increasing issue, but at the moment, as the global assessment argued, that this is not the #1 issue. Even if we have a drought, the problem is that we lost our lakes. That's why the drought is so serious. So we argue that land use change is still a much bigger driver of our crisis, and climate change only comes second in the story.
And then we're again looking back to India, where the old system of creating lakes both helps to mitigate climate change and reversing the loss of biodiversity, probably. What is your answer? Do you agree, Harini, that you can only preserve this knowledge by preserving also the way of living that's connected to this knowledge?
Yes, but also there are new ways. I mean, I think like Zsolt pointed out that, people are adapting to and creating new traditional knowledge. So for instance, we see migrant workers or migrants of all kinds who move to the city. Like I said, they don't have, it's very interesting. They have a rupture of the way they think about the city. So in their village, they respect water, they respect trees, they have their gods and goddesses, they have their relationships. But when they come to the city, they see similar structures and they don't have those relationships. But yet we find that over some time when they stay and they visit places of nature and places of restored nature, for instance, they can slowly pick up those kinds of threads again. And you have different ways in which they recraft those traditions here. So for instance, transgender people, they have a system of worship where you have the transgender goddess of their village, and the one of the place where you are, and then the goddess of the transgender people. So, I mean, sorry, the village goddess, the local goddess, and the goddess of the transgender people. So they have a way of worshipping these as flat stones, but in a hierarchy. And so that is a way of linking their village goddess to their own people and to the local place, and then worshipping them together. So I think there are interesting ways in which they forge these traditions. So people learn about new foraging ways, for instance, in the city, the use of different species. So I think there's a lot of place for things to grow if we don't disrupt the mechanisms through which they learn the knowledge. You know, for instance, one thing people often say, and this is I think across the world, is that when you build seawalls, fishermen and women can no longer read the sea because the way it breaks on the concrete wall is very different from the way the sea waves go on each other. So it actually often sometimes leads to more tragedies because fishermen cannot read the sea and don't know whether they should go out or in anymore. They're only dependent on the weather system warnings, which are often inaccurate.
Thank you so much. I have another question that continues where you stopped right now on the importance of making this kind of hybrid knowledge between old traditional knowledge adapting to the new systems. And the question goes, what about the creation of new knowledge, new local knowledge based on personal experience? We saw in our Mongolian project that to some extent traditional ecologic knowledge is not adequate anymore due to changing environment conditions. And do you also see this in your work? It's maybe even farther than just asking about climate change, but also land use change and the combination of both, plus invasive species.
So when we say that traditional knowledge is dynamic and adaptive, it means that if there's a new challenge, then the knowledge and the practices will change. If they change, they are not yet tested. So we need some time for the new traditional knowledge or for the new local knowledge to get tested. And science can help in speeding up the testing process. Because science can measure attributes what traditional knowledge holders cannot. And traditional knowledge holders can monitor something which science cannot. So knowledge co-production, in my understanding, means that we are developing knowledge that didn't exist before, neither in the scientific knowledge nor the traditional knowledge, but it's a new knowledge. But this is developing through testing. So I would not say that traditional knowledge is outdated. I think that's an unfair approach. We can say that traditional knowledge, the new pieces of traditional knowledge are not yet tested, or the governance structure doesn't help the testing process. But saying that traditional knowledge is outdated means that we killed the adaptation process, or we had not given enough time for the adaptation. So that's my approach to this situation.
Could you, I give you two more comments to both of you, and also I want to add my experience here. The first one is that Volker Moosbrugger says that we also have a mass extinction of languages. To what extent is indigenous knowledge also linked to the indigenous language? And can we preserve indigenous knowledge when the indigenous language is extinct? And here again, I add my experience there. My father told me that there was a special word in the dialect, and the local dialect, that goes extinct right now for horses who walk in a way that they destroy the plants they planted in the while plowing and while seeding. And there's this concept that there can be something as a horse destroying the work on the field is very far from the practical experience from farmers today, who of course work very differently. So thank you so much, Volker, for your idea of reminding us that languages get lost, and also the concept of the diversity of the knowledge that we need the words. What is your experience with that? Harini.
Maybe you go.
Yeah, I have data, not my own data, but there is an indigenous navigator developed by the Forest Peoples Programs and others that they try to calculate the loss of language. And the most general pattern is that if the grandparents' generation speak, let's say 80% of them speaks the local language, the indigenous language, then the parent generation 40% and the young generation 2%. That's the speed of language loss. And usually, yes, we lose a lot of traditional knowledge with language loss, but not all. So not all. So we have to keep working on preventing language loss, but on the other side, keeping traditional knowledge as possible, even when we are losing the language. So, and I know that in Germany, there is an NGO that is actually maintaining the plowing with horses, just for keeping the knowledge of those horses who misbehave. So actually, we can keep knowledge for the post-crisis situation, which is coming very soon.
Oh, well.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and I mean, I think we do of course, we do the main Indian languages, but in our festival for the same reason, because I think we reach many more people in so many different ways when you reach it through their own language. And sometimes some concepts just cannot be translated in English, and they have to be. They're so much more beautiful through the language in which they were created.
Do you feel you can explain what these words, whether if you understand them, to us speaking English, or do you feel it's just a secret that we cannot even grasp?
No, so you can explain it, but you won't get the poetry and the flavor. You can just about explain it, but yeah, you won't quite get it.
Thank you so much. I kind of feel excluded from what you have felt and heard and understood in your research. Thank you so much for this. I want to conclude by giving us a last remark, and I feel like we won't, like in the session before, we won't um, answer all the questions, but raise even more. But here comes this comment. I don't think that scientific approach in Europe developed from traditional knowledge, but against traditional knowledge dominated by Christianity. And then I think we might add also all these philosophers who taught us that animals are no sensitive beings, but just machines to be used, and also the Christian ideas of taking the earth and using it. I know there's more to the Bible,
Yeah.
but
If we don't have
last
time
comment.
to discuss it, that person who raised this issue, I'm happy to discuss it with him or her, because I think we just simply misunderstood each other, and I will be happy to speak with that person. Yeah,
Okay,
later.
you can easily connect on the conference website, but maybe if Volker gives me a small nod and gives me another minute, you can just try to give us an idea of your answer where the misunderstanding was.
Yes,
He
of
just
course. We
Thank you
don't
so
need a lot
much.
of time for our summary. Go on.
Okay. So we would like to follow this path that was raised by Zsolt and also maybe by Harini.
Yeah, this is not going.
Zsolt, could you explain what you were going to answer to the question that maybe
Yeah. So I agree that science for centuries was working against traditional knowledge. Not a question. It's also true that science developed from the Judeo-Christian worldview of separating nature and culture. But when you read the ancient Greek scientists, they very often use traditional knowledge from travelers, from locals, and they incorporated it into their scientific thinking. And even today, even up to today. So why French has so good wine and cheese? Partly because in the 13th century, as I know, people collected village knowledge of winemaking and cheese making, and they synthesized this traditional knowledge and became scientific knowledge, which went back to the villages again. So this interaction is very strong. But I also agree that since the Enlightenment, especially Renaissance, maybe more intensively from the Enlightenment on the 18th century, science is acting deliberately against traditional knowledge in most cases. In the school system says that if you are a herder, you are backward. So I agree with this, but also many of the knowledges came from traditional knowledge into science. We have lots of data. I don't know whether it clears up the
yeah,
issue.
to me it did, and I'd actually love to follow this discussion between the two of you. So maybe next conference could give us a window of opportunity for this. Harini, do you want to close this session by giving us your idea on the relationship of traditional and scientific knowledge and where it kind of maybe helps to develop new ecological knowledge?
In India, very much, because really the scientific knowledge follows the Western scientific frameworks of knowledge, and it's very much a way of thinking about ecology as forestry, which really follows the German system originally, right? Which came then to the British. So that is there, and it's pretty much the same idea that Zsolt was talking about, where what local community knowledge is considered backward and not worth talking about because it's really not scientific. But that said, I think there's a lot of now growing interest in, for instance, using of traditional medicinal herbs for treatment. And there are always indigenous, Ayurveda is a system of treatment which uses a lot of these herbs. So they, through those now, which are now being formalized, for instance, in the government, you can actually go, like you can go to homeopath and get reimbursed, you can go to the Ayurveda system. And that is now trying to use the indigenous knowledge of herbs, but systematize it by saying, okay, how much, what temperature, all of those things. And then that comes back to science. And then it goes back to the rural countryside. So we do see some of the patterns that Zsolt was talking about. And I think that's very interesting. Maybe that's part of a common evolution of taking things back and seeing how they move into different forms.
Thank you so much, Harini and Zsolt. You gave me some kind of hope in the closing of the session that there might be a new way of finding solutions to our destroyed planet and for humanity. Thank you so much for your input.
Thank you.
Please have
Thank
this
you.
discussion. Use the conference network to start all these discussions that were only raised now. So thank you so much again.